I don't think this study did a great job, to be honest, and I really don't think 10 seconds is enough time to determine whether a kid has a preference for a person's face, for a particular face. So if you were on Twitter this week, you may have noticed the fascinating and excellent thread, which I recommend you bookmark, of Christopher Rufo pointing out that the narrative that critical race theory isn't in K through 12 schools is pretty much dead, and in that he laid out quite a huge amount of evidence to say, yes, it is, for that matter, given the amount of things that he's pointed out. But one of the things he pointed out in here was back from his own original reporting, this number from the Arizona Department of Education in here, and racism in the cradle was what it was referred to as, claims that babies develop the first signs of racism at 3 months old. Now, here's the thing. It came with this particular graphic, which I will, of course, link this for you, and Christopher Rufo is an excellent journalist, actually, if you've had the chance to see his stuff. I highly recommend it. But what I can point you to here is this particular number in the corner where it says, at birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. At 3 months, babies look more at faces of that match the race of their caregivers. Kelly et al., 2005. Me, being curious about the study underlying this claim right here, I went and found the study. Got a hold of it. And so I've got some fun for us to talk about. This is the study in question in developmental science. 3 months old, but not newborns prefer own race faces. Here, and this I think is actually open access because I didn't have any problem opening this up. This is the full manuscript in here. So we're going to read. I read through this already, and there's some things I want to point out to you because I do believe this study is flawed upon which to make that claim. Here, just based on a quick read. And admittedly, developmental science and the development of children is not my expertise, but that doesn't mean you can't point out flaws just by quickly reading something and noting that it seems somewhat suspect to think that you can get some information out of this for certain things, and we'll see in a second. Adults are sensitive to the physical differences that define ethnic groups, reading the abstract. However, the age at which we become sensitive to ethnic differences is currently unclear. Now, this is ethnic group, is the way they're phrasing this. Look at the title here. Ask the question, is ethnicity exactly the same as race? Ask the question. Because what they're talking about here in the abstract, and in a lot of places in this article, is ethnic group, not race. Note to self, our study aimed to clarify this by testing newborns and young infants for sensitivity to ethnicity using a visual preference paradigm. While newborn infants demonstrated no spontaneous preferences for faces from either their own or other ethnic groups, 3-month-old infants demonstrated a significant preference for faces from their own ethnic group. These results suggest that preferential selectivity based on ethnic differences is not present in the first days of life, but is learned within the first 3 months of life. The findings imply that adults' perceptions of ethnic differences are learned and derived from differences in exposure to own versus other race faces during early development. Again, flipping back and forth between race and ethnicity. And so the question comes, is race and ethnicity exactly the same thing? Which is not necessarily the case in here. So different ethnic groups exist within races is my point to make on that one. Historically, the perception of human races has had major ramifications for the social and economic livelihoods of people throughout the world. Adults very rapidly make judgments and categorize people according to ethnicity. See? It is likely that both skin color and physiognomic differences are used to make such judgments. Hirschfeld suggests that sensitivity to ethnicity is more than knowledge concerning observable physical difference and instead is a specialized cognitive strategy for reasoning about human collectives. However, while the origins of ethnic categorization must originate from some form of sensitivity to ethnic differences, exactly when and how such knowledge develops is unclear. In the first few days of life, newborn infants display a visual preference for faces, a preference for their mother's face over the stranger's face. But see blank for I'm not going to read all of these names here, a preference for their mother's face over a stranger's face. and the ability to discriminate between faces of their own from their own ethnic group. So within group, you can tell the difference between face of someone you know and with someone you don't know. Also, newborns demonstrate a preference for attractive or unattractive faces. I read that earlier, and I immediately thought to myself, I was like, how the hell does a kid even know the difference? How do you rank attractive versus unattractive? Because that's extremely subjective as adults, and I can't imagine how you would tell that with a child. So honestly, that makes no sense to me. And use information from internal facial features when making this preference. Furthermore, newborns will imitate an array of facial gestures performed by an adult, of course, because they're learning from adults as they're growing what to do and all that kind of stuff. Collectively, these findings suggest that newborns very rapidly form a face representation, are sensitive to subtle physiognomic variations, attend to internal facial features, and learn from faces in their visual environment. Indeed, you learn things about smiling and all that kind of stuff. You see a parent smile at you, and the child naturally wants to return, "Oh, I'm doing good thing," and all that. There is mounting evidence in support of a proposal that face processing system is shaped by the faces seen in the visual environment. Experiential effects on face processing have thus far been reported for attributes of gender, race, and species. With respect to gender, at 3 months of age, infants raised primarily by a female caregiver demonstrate a preference for female over male faces, or are better able to discriminate among female faces than male faces. Conversely, infants raised by a primarily male caregiver demonstrate a preference for male faces over female faces. And this is no surprise. It looks like the other face looks a little bit more like the person you care for. The person giving you care yourself. That doesn't necessarily... See, preference for something, because it looks a bit like you, does not necessarily equate to some of the evils that the woke have tried to claim using this article, or that the Arizona Department of Education has tried to claim with this article and pushing things with talking about race. For the attribute of race, Sangroli and Deshonen, which I do have that study too, actually, I stumbled over it before I found this one, have recently demonstrated at 3 months of age, Caucasian infants are able to discriminate between own race faces but not other race faces. This discrimination bias may represent an early manifestation of a similar deficit seen in adults, which is typically called the other race effect. So, thinking about this, the idea that someone who is of your own race, you can distinguish between people of your own race more so than you can people of other races. And that study, I think I have it. Yeah. I do have it right here. That is this study. This one is behind a paywall, so I haven't had the chance to look at it yet in its full study, but they candidly put in this nice little bit here that we can look at. So in order to find out whether other race... Yeah, I mean, I'll link this one for you. I don't want to dwell on this one right now, with this because I want to look at the other article because the other article has some more interesting things in it. But I will link it for you if you want to try and get to it. However, the effect present in infants appears to have greater plasticity than the effect reported in adults. In a follow-up experiment from Sangreli and Deschone, when infants were familiarized with 3 individual faces as opposed to the one in the first experiment, they were able to demonstrate recognition with both own and other race faces. This latter result suggests that only with limited experiences with faces from other races, abilities to discriminate with an own and other race face categories can be rendered equivalent. So, all this has to do, the main question of this experiment, really, that they did here, is at what point does a kid start to recognize faces that looks like the people who care for them? What this is being painted as is that, by the woke, what studies like this are painted as, let me go back here, is that kids are already at 3 months prejudicial against. In other words, passing judgments based upon race. And I mean judgments with regards to character. We're talking about racism, which the definition of racism that I use and that most of you all use is the idea that one race is superior, that somebody believes that a race is superior or inferior to another race, or to all other races. That's what they're equating with this, that kids are become racist by 3 months old, is what this is being equated as. That is not actually what that study says. The assumption, the leap being made, is that if a kid prefers a face that looks like the people who care for them, they tend to fixate more on it, then they're becoming prejudicial against other races. Does that make sense? That is the assumptive leap that is being made between this study and what is being done in the woke-ish kind of world here, and including the Arizona Department of Education. Let's see. Okay. With regard to the processing of species information from faces, at 6 months of age, infants are able to discriminate between both human and monkey faces, whereas 9-month-olds and adults can only discriminate human faces. Wait a second. At 6 months of age, infants are able to discriminate both human and monkey faces. Well, yeah, a monkey, generally speaking, doesn't look like a human and definitely doesn't look like your mother or your father. Whereas 9 months old can only discriminate human faces. Oh, I see. Tell the difference between different humans and tell the difference between different monkeys. That's what I think they're trying to get at. Exposure to monkey faces between 6 and 9 months of age allows the infant to maintain the ability to discriminate monkey faces. The combined results from studies of gender, race, species, and processing of faces by infants illustrate that facial input received early in life influences the development of the infant face representation and subsequent face processing abilities. The notion of face representation is best understood within the framework of the multidimensional face model described by Valentine. Valentine proposes a norm-based coding model in which faces are encoded as vectors according to their deviation from the prototypical average. At birth, dimensions of the prototype are to be broad and largely unspecified. Yes, of course, that makes sense. So what they're talking about here is the preferential idea is in the sense that you basically as a person, you have an average face in mind, is what they're thinking here. You have an average face in mind, and then you're looking at it from the sense of how much does a face that you are seeing of a person deviate from the average. That's the kind of thing there. When you're born, you don't have an average set because you haven't had a whole bunch of faces come into view. You've probably seen your parents. You've probably seen a sibling if you've just been born and you had siblings, or you've seen an animal maybe if you have pets in the home. But you may not have seen a huge amount of other faces if you're just a newborn. So you got that. You don't have that average setup, is what they're talking about here. With the development of prototype being dependent upon facial input, the resulting dimensions will differ according to the input received, with certain salient individuating dimensions carrying more weight than others. Predominant exposure to faces of a specific gender, ethnicity, or species early in life may result in both the physiogenomic and skin color dimensions of one's prototype becoming tuned toward such faces. In other words, your average face, what they're arguing here, is the average face, that is the norm that somebody recognizes right away, is tuned by what you're exposed to early in your life. The idea then being that if you have a preference for a particular face, taking the leap from science to the woke, if you have a preference for that particular face, you could then jump over into being prejudicial against people who don't have the same face, i.e. the same race, ethnicity, gender, or anything like that. The preferential tuned prototype normative that you grow up with in your first 3 months of life is what they're thinking about here. The aim of the current study was to further investigate the emergence of sensitivity to ethnicity and how it is shaped by the infant's visual environment. It also sought to investigate a possible mechanism by which differential experience with same versus other race faces might lead to superior recognition of the same race faces. Specifically, we examined whether early differential experience with the same versus other race might lead to an acquired preference for the same versus other faces. So, again, this is about preference for a face. This is not about assigning judgments based upon race that are associated with character, or with skill, or with ability. There is none of that there. And in fairness to them, they cannot, not in fairness to them, in fairness to reality, there is no way that you can judge that in a 3-month-old because they can't articulate it. They cannot articulate anything of what they think about the character of a person. Can't talk. You're an infant. To assess spontaneous preference for same versus other race faces, Caucasian newborn and 3-month-old infants were exposed to faces from a range of ethnic groups using a visual preference task. The VP task has successfully been used in previous studies to assess both newborns and 3-month-old spontaneous preference for stimuli. Our expectation is that, due to the lack of exposure to faces in general, newborns will not display a preference for faces from an ethnic group. However, an alternative possibility is that newborns will have already encoded the skin color and physiogenomic information from their mother's face and subsequently prefer faces which most closely match that of the color and physiognomy, i.e. Caucasian. Therefore, it remains unclear whether newborns will demonstrate spontaneous preferences for faces from own or other ethnic groups. Following the results on gender preference, we hypothesized that 3-month-old would demonstrate a preference for faces from their own ethnic group based on predominant exposure to same race faces from birth. Okay, do you see the problem there? The entire focus is on Caucasian kids. It's entirely on white kids. They did not do this study on anyone else. Do you see how that can be used in a very bad way? To say that white kids in particular have a preference for one race for their own race. They have an internalized sense of superiority, as the woke would put it. Do you see how that could work? So this is immediately a flaw in this study, is that they only focused on Caucasian faces. They did not focus on any other race at all, and we'll get into that in a second. Let's see. So this is the experiment, and I want you to pay attention here to the stimuli, to the procedure with both of these experiments, because there's two. And I want you to notice something important. A few things, actually, that are important. In experiment 1, Caucasian newborn infants viewed pairs of faces from a range of ethnic groups using a VP task. Newborn infants were recruited and tested in the Royal Hamilshire Hospital in Sheffield, UK. In total, 64 full-term healthy newborns, 36 females, age 16 hours old. 16 hours old. Okay? With the mean here being 69 hours old of life. You've been alive, in this case, most of these kids likely been alive for less than 5 days, and at most, 24, wait a minute, 24 hours, no, the mean here, the mean here, this is what, 72 would be 3 days, 72 hours would be 3 days, this is less than 3 days old. The mean here of this sample of 64 newborns is 3 days old. Were included in the final sample. A further 26 newborns were excluded from the final sample due to side bias, fussiness, or falling asleep. They're newborns. What did you expect? So let's see. When you take the 64, you exclude 26. Okay, so you end up at 38 total kids that were actually taking part in this. All newborns were randomly assigned to one of 4 ethnic pairing conditions, with 16 in each condition. Because infants participated in only one condition, they were exposed to the same number of own and other race faces. This feature of the experimental design prevented a potential within experiment familiarity preference from developing across trials. Stimuli were 32 colored images of male and female adult faces from 4 different ethnic groups: Caucasian, Middle Eastern, Asian, and African. Right here you can see them, and that is typically when they include these in the studies, that's actually what they show the kids. Just bear that in mind. That is actually exactly what they showed the kids here. In terms of what was a Caucasian face, a Middle Eastern face, an Asian face, and an African face. Or an African face and an Asian face. I got the order mixed up. Sorry. From 4 distinct ethnic groups: Caucasian, Middle Eastern, Asian, African, which were paired as follows: African, Caucasian, Middle Eastern, Caucasian, Asian, Caucasian, and Caucasian and Caucasian. All pictures were taken with a camera. Okay. Faces were rated on a scale of 1 to 10 for attractiveness and distinctiveness by 16 independent observers who subsequently paired to equate for gender attractiveness and distinctiveness. luminosity. So this has to do with scientifically measuring the darkness of the skin tones in each one, which those kinds of things there. Okay, let's see. This is the actual procedure. Newborns were tested in a quiet room, seated in an upright position in a padded infant car chair, which was secured to a table, limiting movement, ensuring safety, approximately 30 centimeters from a screen measuring 45 centimeters by 30 centimeters, onto which the paired images were projected. They were randomly assigned to one of 4 ethnic pairing conditions, with 16 in each condition. Each newborn was shown 2 face pairings, 1 male and 1 female. The presentation of slides was counterbalanced for gender and left-right positioning of images across the trials, which means they flipped the order and they would change the positioning of the images every so often. Eye movements were recorded and the film digitized to be analyzed frame by frame by 2 independent observers on a computer using specialized software. The average level of inter-observer agreement was high, Pearson R87. Okay, so what this is that what they're doing in this experiment, just to break it down for you, is they have a screen that's projected there. They have a camera or somebody watching. Which one do the kids focus on? So there's a certain amount of person a bit involved here with the people behind the scenes who are recording. Where were the kids looking in this thing? When projected onto the screen, all images measured 18 centimeters by 18 centimeters with a 14-degree visual angle, and were positioned side by side, separated by a 9-centimeter gap. I give them credit, they'll make it easy to replicate this experiment. Each pair of images was displayed until 10 seconds of fixation time had elapsed. Just put it this way. Let me read that again. Each pair of images was displayed until 10 seconds of fixation time had elapsed. That's important, as we talk about in a minute. If the newborn spent 10 seconds looking away from the projected images, the trial was terminated. 10 seconds. By the way, it's 10 seconds that you're looking at something. 10 seconds. And that's how they're assigning preference, is how much of that 10 seconds of fixation time were they looking at one image versus another. 10 seconds. Between each image pairing, a blank screen was presented for 5 seconds or until the newborn moved their eyes from the final point of fixation from the previous trial. So in other words, the kid may not have realized that the image changed. A black and white CCD camera specialized for low light conditions was used to film the neonate's eye movements. This was displayed to the experimenters during recording on an ITC control monitor. Time was recorded and displayed on the control monitor using a Horita 2 at 25 frames per second. Preliminary examination of the data revealed no significant effects of gender on looking times, so they were combined for further analysis. A paired sample, 2 t-test sample observation overall meant that looking times of newborns attended equally to both Caucasian and other races. The overall null preference was represented within each of the 3 ethnicity conditions. Middle East, 49, 49.83, 51, with no comparison approaching significance. Newborns also displayed a null preference in the Caucasian versus Caucasian condition. Overall, the results attained in Experiment 1 suggest at birth newborns display no spontaneous preference for faces from their own or other ethnic groups. Although null results can be difficult to interpret, it is unlikely that these results are due to the inability to differentiate between faces from different ethnic groups, given that newborns discriminate between faces from within their own ethnic group. Its most likely account is that newborns are able to discriminate between faces between different ethnic groups, but no group elicits greater attraction. The most likely account is that newborns are able to discriminate between faces from different ethnic groups, but no group elicits a greater attraction. And the reason they're calling this is because apparently they can differentiate between faces within their own group. Now, let me see here. When they do that discrimination between faces from within their own ethnic group, do you have evidence then that the kid has preference for one face from their own ethnic group over another? Because that's actually what this is more about. This is about preference, not whether or not you can differentiate between the two. Problem right here. In Experiment 2, 3-month-old infants were tested in identical manner to Experiment 1. It was predicted that infants would demonstrate a familiarity preference for Caucasian faces over other race faces on the basis of greater experience with same race faces. Infants should demonstrate a null preference in the Caucasian condition. Participants were 3-month-old infants who had been recruited from the Royal Hampshire Hospital in Sheffield, UK. 64 full-term 3-month-old infants, 42 females of normal birth weights were included in the final sample. Further 18 infants were excluded due to side bias or fussiness. So in other words, we ended up with 36, both cases. All mothers reported that their babies, I'm sorry, not 36, 38. No, in this case it's 36 because it's 18. All mothers reported that their baby had received little or no contact with people from non-Caucasian ethnic groups. All mothers reported, understand something, all mothers reported that their baby had received little or no contact with people from non-Caucasian ethnic groups. And in reasonable fashion here, you're caring for a 3-month-old. And particularly if you're a new parent, are you taking them everywhere? Are you exposing them to everything if you're a little bit nervous as a brand new parent? Think about that one logically, too. Now, the other thing to point out here is they were tested in a manner identical to Experiment 1. It was the same faces in here. It was the same faces. Now, let me read the procedure of Experiment 2, and then I want to go back to Experiment 1 and remind you about something. 3-month-old infants were tested in a quiet room in the Department of Psychology at the University of Sheffield, UK. Infants were seated on their mother's lap, approximately 60 centimeters away. Due to improved visual acuity compared to newborns, a greater viewing distance is appropriate for 3-month-old infants. From a screen onto which the images were projected, infants were randomly assigned to one of the same 4 ethnic pairing conditions that were used in the first experiment. The procedure for testing was identical to that of Experiment 1. All mothers were instructed to fixate centrally above the screen to remain quiet during testing. Eye movements were recorded, and the film was then digitized to be analyzed frame by frame by 2 independent observers on a computer using specialized software. The average level of inter-observer agreement was high. Pearson R90. R squared of 90. Correlation of 90. There we go. So, do you notice if you remember what I just said with the procedure for the other first experiment and the procedure for this experiment, do you notice some interesting things that are very different that could affect the outcome of how a kid is behaving at 3 months versus how they behave as a newborn? In here with the newborns, mom wasn't there. Mom wasn't there holding her kid. Here's the question. Would the newborn have behaved differently if mom was there holding the kid? Did you think about that? The other thing, 3 months old. Think about a kid at 3 months old. Are they looking around? Are they fixating on anything? Or what are they? There's so much that's more coming to view because, of course, your eyes have developed a lot since then. You're asking for a kid, you're determining preference again. Not just in newborns. They did this the same way with 3 months old. You're determining preference with newborns by having them look at it for 10 seconds. Fixation of 10 seconds. A total fixation time of 10 seconds. 10 seconds fixing on a person's face for preference with a 3-month-old. Does that seem like it actually works for you for determining determining ethnic preference in this? Because to me it doesn't. That actually seems a very short time for a kid who may be like, oh, okay, whatever. Ooh, looks interesting. Oh, go over here. Looks interesting over here. Could be any number of different things that cause that to happen. A newborn isn't half as active as a 3-month-old. And so that's one thing I immediately questioned with this. I was like, how are you even determining preference when the amount of time you're having there to determine whether or not a kid has a preference for a face is 10 seconds. 10 seconds. And again, also, this is only Caucasian faces. This is only Caucasian, this is not only Caucasian faces. This is only Caucasian kids that they are testing. They did not do this with any other kids of any other race. They did not do it. So, in the thing here, it's important to understand this. Preliminary examination once more revealed no significant gender differences, so the results were combined. A paired samples two-tailed t-test conducted on the total time looking at Caucasian versus other race faces yielded significant result. Overall, infants tended to be more Caucasian than other attended more to Caucasian than other race faces, 58.8 to 41.2 respectively. Okay, so they say, according to their test, this is highly correlated. This is a little bit in the technical weeds. Paired two-sample t-tests. Here. Paired samples, two-tailed t-test. Interesting. Here with that. And also, this goes back to the 10-second thing now that I'm thinking about it as paired. You're looking at it, 10 seconds total looking at the screen. That's what they're waiting for, is 10 seconds total looking at the screen before they flip to the next screen or before they flip to a blank page for a little bit. So that's what they're doing, is there's 10 seconds, they're waiting for 10 seconds where the kid is looking at the screen. And it's 10 seconds. In that 10 seconds, that's how much, they're basically, of that 10 seconds the kid looks at the screen, how much time is looking at one face versus the other face? What if it's 5 seconds and 5 seconds? What if it's 6 seconds and 4 seconds? Is that really a preferential difference? You know? This is where I'm annoyed with them, that I want to actually see the numbers. I want to actually see the spread, but I don't think they put it in here from what I could read. The other thing, and this is a little bit more technical and in the weeds, paired two-sample t-test requires that both of the samples in here be normally distributed, meaning they're that nice bell curve shape. That test fails. That test fails spectacularly if it's not normally distributed. And so I have no way of knowing what the distribution is. Is it this weird kind of skewed shape off over here? Or is it the nice bell curve, which in this case, great, you use the right test for that. That's a little bit statistically in the weeds. But yes, a paired sample two-tailed t-test, you're relying on the distribution of the data being normal, being a bell curve in both of those samples, which is a very rare thing, or being a rare thing to be able to make that assumption. But think about that. 10 seconds. 10 seconds for each pairing of faces that they're looking at in here. 10 seconds, and it's 10 seconds total time fixation on the panel before they move to the next one. So out of that 10 seconds, how much of the 10 seconds of total time, and within that 10 seconds, because they're looking at the total 10 seconds of time fixated on things, so for some of that time, they might be off over here looking, or they might be over here looking, oh, hey, look at that thing on the floor. Things like that can happen also in this experiment, but what they care about is that 10 seconds where the kid is looking at the screen, either one face or the other face. Again, 6 seconds or 4 seconds, or did they spend all 10 seconds looking at this one face that looked a bit more like mom? Things like that. That is how they're determining that is how they're determining ethnic preference of faces here, is 10 seconds of time for each of these things. With multiple repetitions, of course, and that's great that they're doing multiple repetitions, but it is still 10 seconds. A child could easily do 5 and 5. That's what I want to see a little bit more of here, and you know what, they didn't do that, perhaps, and that's great. I still question the skewness of these things that they're actually looking at that, but fine. A paired sample t-test yielded significant result preferences in all conditions. Bear in mind that the sample goes down because you have 16 different conditions here, and you don't necessarily have enough of a sample to be able to make these. And indeed, the significance of a lot of these actually goes down pretty significantly. This is the only one where it's really significant because you basically put Caucasian against everything else. So there is that. In addition, the displayed null preference, Caucasian versus Caucasian. So no, yeah. In other words, no preference for one Caucasian face over another. And that's the one where they're saying it was probably 5 seconds for each one, or 0 and 0, or something along that line. So this is the thing that's the thing that bothers me with it, if you think about it. So, but they do, bear in mind that it's on 10 seconds. Bear in mind that it's done when you're looking at it, when a newborn and a 3-month-old looking at a screen for 10 seconds. Not an actual person's face or anything like that. And there's another question. How much has the kid been exposed to screens? You know? How much has a kid who is a newborn, 3 months old, been exposed to a screen? Can they recognize a face on a screen? Here's the thing. There. As I'm thinking about it more, I get more questions that come to my mind. Let's see. Overall, the results from experiments 1 and 2 demonstrate that preferential selectivity based on ethnic differences is not present in the first days of life, but is learned within the first 3 months of life. The findings, in turn, imply that adults' perceptions of ethnic differences are learned and derived from differences in exposure to own versus other races during early development. This is where they're getting the idea that someone can become racist at 3 months old. This is it right here, because it's just like, oh, you're learning, you're developing a preference for people of your own race at 3 months old. You must be racist. That's where that comes in when you're equating it to the woke. I'm not saying these authors did that, but that's where the woke take this from a leap. Also, in concordance with earlier findings, the current data support the notion of a broad and unspecified face processing system at birth that becomes tuned through facial input at the very early stage in life. While it may be correct that in adulthood ethnicity represents more than just an observation of physical differences, we maintain that a conception of ethnicity is found in the sensitivity to ethnic physical differences in infancy. While the preference for own race faces is observed and in 3 months old may be evident, I don't know about that, it is unclear which facial component, skin color, physiognomy, or both, physiognomy has to do with like the bone structure and the shape of your face, is responsible for the effect. Although there was a clear contrast between the Asian and Caucasian faces, and wait a second, now that I read it, well, okay, it's not fair because they're only showing some of them here. They have 32 images, so there's 7 more panels of this. But I'm just wondering, this might have been a poor choice for the paper because I think the physiognomy between each of these faces is fairly different myself. So that's the thing there. Okay, where was I? Although there was a clear contrast between African versus Caucasian faces, the difference between Middle Eastern and Caucasian faces was minimal. Asian-Caucasian face difference was almost indistinguishable. So, again, this is the thing where they're coming at it with the woke. A study may be well done. A study may be poorly done. I'm inclined to think that this is somewhere on the end of poorly done, not well done. But a study done either way tends to carry with it the sort of veneer of authenticity that can come with scientific studies. And so it's very easy to fall into an appeal to authority fallacy with this, that, look, a study was done that shows this, therefore we should be talking about this at that time. And because of a lack of logic sometimes amongst the woke, that's where they'll go with it. It's like, look, science says this, and it may be that the science says that, but the point is, I'm pointing out here, people may recognize faces and have a preference for faces, but that does not equate with assigning character traits. I went full Tweety there for a minute. Doesn't equate assigning character traits with different races or different ethnicities. Doesn't equate to that. The kid has not had that much experience with that yet. Has not been alive that long to be able to equate and make those develop that characteristic. That falls on the parents to talk about not to talk about that with them, but to model that for them, to model that behavior, whatever behavior it is, and they may learn that behavior, but they, may also figure it out on their own. Oh, hey, these people are amazing. All these are amazing people. You're teaching about individualism and what have you. A kid is not necessarily going to have a prejudicial attitude toward a person whose race, whose ethnicity of their face doesn't match the one that they know and they're most familiar with. This is about familiarity, this study. It is not necessarily about prejudicial attitudes or behavior. It is not at all, actually. It's not at all about prejudicial attitudes and behavior. Having a preference for a particular face because it is familiar to you and because it's someone who cares for you and it's someone you've grown to trust at 3 months old and all this kind of stuff doesn't mean you're developing an attitude of hating or despising or othering someone who does not share that face. One does not follow from the other, is my point to make here. And that is where it has been leading from with these kinds of things, and this thing from Arizona where you can, in here. And I really question the other study that I saw in there about race being used as a reason, people being able to assign judgments on race at 2 years old. I kind of doubt that. Despite these differences. And the other thing is they never, I also wonder, you know, if the kids had been, they talked about it, Caucasian kids in here, they had Caucasian kids in there that were never exposed. The Caucasian kids in the experiment were never exposed to people of other races, and that makes a whole lot of sense. That may not happen because, you know, you're a new parent and what have you. Think about that in the sense that, you know what, you didn't incorporate in this sample any parents of biracial families. Anyway, I'm sorry, kids who are biracial and, you know, have multiracial families. You didn't, it doesn't seem like they actually incorporated that in this study. That these were kids who had no exposure at all to kids of other races. So that's another thing that I wonder about. You know, if you had done that, what would be the difference there? If you had, you know, would there still be a preference for something that, oh, hey, look, it looks like mom? Would there still be that preference? You didn't look at any other races aside from Caucasian kids and how they behave. Anything like that. So, okay, what about African kids? What about kids from African families? What about Asian kids? What about Hispanic kids? All those kinds of things. Why not look at those kids too? You could do that. You could do that. I mean, you could theoretically replicate this whole thing with other things, but you didn't do that. And so that's very, 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 very crazy. And you're not saying it's, you're not doing the, you're not doing, you can't do a whole lot with this, with generalization here. And that's what makes this extremely unfortunate, because it's a study that could be used in poor manner, in line with the interests of the woke in here. And that's what makes me curious. And admittedly, they did acknowledge it. One limitation of the current study, as well as that of the Sangroli and Dishon, is that only Caucasian participants were tested. It will thus be necessary to extend the results to both studies to infants from other ethnic groups to assess whether these findings can be generalized across ethnic groups. Yeah, so I mean, I don't think this study did a great job, to be honest, and I really don't think 10 seconds is enough time to determine whether a kid has a preference for a person's face, for a particular face, or whether they have developed a direct preference for a particular face of a particular ethnicity. Again, 10 seconds. Newborns and 3 months old both had 10 seconds. The other thing that I noticed was a difference. Oh, 3-month-old has mom there. I can look up at mom and then look over at the faces, and I may fixate more on the one that looks like mom who's right there with me. Why not put the 3-month-old in there without mom? Or without dad? I think this was all moms if I remember correctly, but yeah, it was all moms. But yeah, you had moms in one and you didn't in the other. That's not a perfectly good control either. You only tested on Caucasian kids. You didn't test anything else. Again, normalcy of the sample, I question that. There's actually a very small sample, too, when it comes to kids and what have you. Although I can understand some of the reasons for that. Some of the ethical issues around doing psychological and medical things with children makes it very difficult to get a large sample size. So some of that I can understand. But that's where I'm just like, I don't buy it, to be honest. I don't buy it because you're making a judgment on whether or not a kid can gives preference to a face in 10 seconds, and you also biased it by having the mother there. The kid could look at the mother and then look at the images to say then, oh, which one looks more like mom? That was a bias of the sample to me, and that's why this study, I think, is one of the big reasons why I think the study is incredibly flawed. You heard me lay out a whole bunch. Okay, that's it. I, of course, will link all of this for you in the description. This video has gotten long enough. But that's the infamous study that they were referring to in the Arizona Department of Education. 3 months old, but not newborns, prefer own race faces. You can read it what you will. This is actually pretty much available to anybody, so I encourage you to go read it and parse through it and tell me what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you like the video. Of course, pop on over to shiasophia.locals.com if you want to talk about this and all that much more without the censorship, and come on over to Locals and we can do that. Share the video, comment the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. And if you liked all this, I hope you did. Have a grand old time, and until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious, my friends.